Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us in his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in words of Torah. Now, before we get started here tonight, let me get over to my page where we're looking at so that I can see what it is that we're doing. Now, can you see the? It says it's sharing, and you can see the cover page, History of Israel. Hopefully, just somebody pipe up and said, "Yeah, you can see it." Okay, all right. Then, so this is where we're going to be here tonight in 2 Kings 18, just for about 6 verses, and then in 2 Chronicles 29 and 30. So, so here's our map again of what the divided kingdoms, and then we'll have a map later on that will show you the tribal breakdown again, because that becomes important for us too. And another map that shows the countries that are around Israel. And now this map here would actually be prior to 722 BCE, because in 722 BCE, as we all know, the Assyrian Empire up here, they attacked Samaria, laid siege to it, conquered it, and then they carried off the royalty of the kingdom of Israel, all of the government, the high muckety mucks. They carried them off into Assyria, which was their normal practice. That was a way of keeping subjugated people under control, is to take away their leadership, and so that's what they did. And here's our timeline that we'll show you. We're going to be looking right here at Hezekiah. Okay, that's everything that we're going to be doing tonight is going to be Hezekiah. And next week we'll also be into a little bit of Hezekiah, but right here, this is where we'll be tonight, beginning at about 715 BCE. And Hezekiah, he reigned from 715 to 687 BCE. And like we'd already said, the northern kingdom of Israel fell in 722 BCE. So about 7 years after Hezekiah became the king at the age of 25, then the northern tribes, or the northern kingdom of Israel, then fell to Assyria. Now, during this time, the prophets that are in the Bible that spoke of Israel and Judah, during this time frame, there was Micah, we know him as, and Isaiah, and then last couple of weeks, or 3 weeks ago, we talked about Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah, and how he was one of the worst kings that Judah had ever had. He was just rotten, just plain rotten, and it seemed like that if he couldn't do something nasty and evil, he would try to think up things that would be nasty and evil to do, and he was pretty good at that. 2 Kings 18, 1-3. Now in the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abijah, a daughter of Zechariah, and he did what was right in Adonai's eyes, according to all his ancestor David had done. All right, now, so what we see here is the polar opposite of what his father was before he became the king. And we see only these 6 verses that we're going to look at here in 2 Kings. Those are the only verses that we see in 2 Kings about Hezekiah, even though he was one of the best of the best. There's only 3 verses, but then there's several chapters devoted to him in Chronicles, and so we see that he was the son of Hezekiah. The son of Hezekiah. Okay, this is all messed up. He was the son of Ahaz. Hezekiah was the son of Ahaz, and Abijah, the daughter of King Zechariah. So I got that messed up. Okay, but we'll know that Abi was probably or possibly the godly influence that helped shape Hezekiah, because that would be about the only reason I can think of that would explain how Hezekiah could be that polar opposite of his ungodly father Ahaz. And so the Bible says that he did what was right in the eyes of Adonai. And the next few verses there talk about how that it's the Cliff Notes version of Hezekiah. It said he removed the high places, smashed the pillars, and cut down the Asherah poles. He also broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for up to those days Bnei Israel was still burning incense to it. It was called Nehushtan. And he trusted in Adonai, the God of Israel. Indeed, none of all of the kings of Judah after him was like him, and none before him. For he clung to Adonai. He did not turn away from following him, but kept his mitzvot, which Adonai had commanded Moses. All right, so these 3 verses here just sum up all that Hezekiah did during his reign. One of the interesting things that that I saw in this, and you may not have even kind of picked up on it, was in the midst of tearing down all of the pagan altars on the high places and all of that, Hezekiah also destroyed this puppy here, this serpent that, if you remember, Moses had to put that up at God's command. When the children of Israel, they were in the wilderness and they got to complaining and just kvetching about everything. And so God said, I'm kind of tired of that. And so he sent serpents among them, and they would, the serpents were venomous, and the people were dying in droves. And so they cried out to God and to Moses. And so God said, okay, fashion a serpent, put it up on the pole, and then anyone that looks at the serpent would be healed and would not die. So they did that, and they kept that serpent around for the next 800 years, after Moses, and the people were actually burning incense to this thing, using it as kind of an icon that they would pray to for healing or whatever, burning, whatever they did when they were burning incense. So that was interesting that Hezekiah looked at that, saw it for what it was, and said, no, that's not what we should be doing. We're not supposed to be praying and burning incense to something like this that was just put up for that one time, and it was a just a one-off kind of a deal that God had told Moses to do, to break the serpents, killing the Israelites. So and in this little section of scripture here, they had pretty high praise for Hezekiah. It said that he trusted God, he trusted Adonai, the God of Israel, and there were none in Judah like him before him, and there were none after him. He stood out among all of them before and after, that he was the one king that really had it put together. And he was a true follower of Torah. So in the first month of the first year of his reign, he opened the doors of the house of Adonai and repaired them. He brought in the Kohanim and the Levites and assembled them into the eastern square. Then he said to them, listen to me, Levites, sanctify yourself. and sanctify the house of Adonai, the God of your fathers, and remove the defilement out of the holy place. Now, Hezekiah did not waste any time in starting these reforms. It says in the very first month of his reign as king, he reopened the doors of the temple that had been shut by his father Ahaz. He gathered the priests and the Levites together, and he began the process of returning to worshiping Adonai. And so, if you remember that when we were studying about Ahaz, he had closed up the temple. Basically, he had shut the people out of any kind of worshiping God. The priests, it appears that they had just kind of melted back out into their villages and towns, and because Hezekiah had to go and bring them back and reassemble them. And so the very first thing he did was to go in there and open up the temple doors as if to say to the people, okay, we are now, God's house of worship is open for business. And so he called the Levites, the priests and the Levites together. Now, why do we say the priests and the Levites? Aren't the priests also Levites? Yes, priests are also Levites. The Kohanim are also Levites. But there were four major clans, four major divisions within the family or the clan of the tribe of Levi. And that was, of course, Aaron, and then there was Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Okay, now each one of these four clans had specific duties before God. The ones who were of the clan of Aaron, they were the actual Kohanim. Okay, they were the priests. All of the other the families from Gershon, Kohath, and Merari, they were support staff. And they did things when the tabernacle was in play. They're the ones that would break down the tabernacle and tote it here or there and do the upkeep of it and so forth. And now that there was a temple, then they did again maintenance. They did some of the clans in here. They were guards. They provided the police force to keep people from doing crazy stuff around the temple, and just a kind of a guard force in Jerusalem. And so they all had different functions, and that's why we today say, why we're calling them the Kohanim and the Levites. Okay, and so Hezekiah then he regathered everyone from wherever they were in Judah, and he gave orders to them, okay, now it's time to sanctify yourself. There are specific rules and regulations for sanctifying yourself. If you look in the book of Leviticus 20, 21, and 20 and 21, they got rules for the Levites. That's in the Parsha Emor, which we just finished off this last week. So they're elaborate things, very specific things that the priest would have to do, the Kohanim would have to do to be sanctified or set apart properly for the service of God. That's what the sanctification means. All right. And so going ahead, our fathers acted unfaithfully and did evil in the sight of Adonai Eloheinu and have forsaken him. They have turned their faces away from Adonai's dwelling place, turned their backs on him. They also shut the doors of the porch and put out the lamps. They did not burn incense or offering any burnt offerings to the holy place, to the God of Israel. Therefore, the wrath of Adonai was upon Judah and Jerusalem. He has made them an object of horror, dread, and scorn, as you are seeing with your own eyes. Behold, for this our fathers have fallen by the sword, and our sons, daughters, and wives are in captivity. So we see that Hezekiah here, he remembered, he knows their history. And even more importantly, he understood their history, and that that his ancestors had turned their back on God, and they had led the people astray, and because of this, those actions led to God's judgment against his people. And at this point he's thinking Israel, the people of Israel, because they have, some of them have already been carried away. It's still fresh on his mind, that people have been carried away, because the major fall of Israel was in 722, and Hezekiah had become king in 715 BCE. So there was a 7-year stretch there. But Sennacherib and some of the other surrounding kings had already come into Samaria and Israel and carried off a bunch of people. So it was not, not all was not well in Israel, and so he already knew that a lot of people had been carried off into captivity by that time. Okay, and so now we go into verse 10. Now it is in my heart to make a covenant with Adonai, the God of Israel, so that his fierce anger may turn away from us. My sons, now do not be negligent, for Adonai has chosen you to stand before him, to serve him, and to be his ministers, and to burn incense to him. So here he is. He's starting his sales pitch to the Kohanim and the Levites. And he said that what he would really like to do is to make a covenant with God. He considered already that the covenant that God had, the Mosaic covenant, as it were, with Israel, he figured that he just looked at it and said, it's broke, and we have broken that treaty, and so therefore I would like to make a new treaty with a new covenant with God, so that we could keep, because my ancestors have already broken this covenant. And so that's what he wanted to do, and his idea was that if they could do that, then God's fierce anger would turn away from Israel and Judah. And so he's telling them, please don't be negligent. Let's get this done, because you're the ones, you Levites and all of you, all of the Levites and the priests there. You're the ones that are chosen to minister before God. Now, you have a special calling, and so stay with that. Be there for us, because we will need you to get back to God. All right. Now then, the next, there's from 12 to 18, they've got a listing. I didn't read it because it takes too much time, but it's just a listing of what some of the priests and their names, and what they did to get ready for the consecration and so forth. So more of administrative aspects to those scriptures. So we'll pick it up at verse 17. They began the consecration on the first day of the first month, and by the 8th day of the month they reached the porch of Adonai. For 8 days they consecrated the house of Adonai, and finished on the 16th day of the first month. And then they went into Hezekiah and said, we have purified the entire house of Adonai, the altar of burnt offerings with all its vessels, the table of the rows of bread with all the vessels. We have also prepared and consecrated all the articles that King Ahaz discarded in his unfaithfulness while he was the king. Behold, they are now before the altar of Adonai. All right, so the Kohanim, they went through the temple, and they were removing every unclean thing. Now remember that it had been years, literally years, since somebody had been made offerings and incense, and lit the lamps, and all of that. They had worship that was in the temple, and that was based on the worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So these people, I mean, it had just been shuttered, barred, and so it was filthy in there. I don't know how many years. We don't really know how many years, but it was a lot. And certainly through the time of Ahaz, that and he was king for more than 25 years. I forget now how many years he was king for. And so that place had been closed up. And you can imagine, in the Middle East, where they have sandstorms and things like that, and birds would fly into the place, and then maybe other kind of critters would get in there, and basically they just trashed the temple. And so it took them 8 days and they had a lot of Kohanim that went into the temple. There were a lot of those guys, and it still took them 8 full days just to sweep the place out and get it clean and get all of the defilement out of it, the dirt and the things that didn't belong there, and cleaning it up and so forth. So it was not that big a building, and there may have been hundreds of these Kohanim to go in there. It still took them 8 days. And at that point, then they said that, well, we'll just take it out of the temple and we'll pile it up at the front door, at the gate, or at the altar. And so that's what they did. They just took the stuff and just swept it out of the temple, pushed it out before the altar of God into the courtyard. And so it took them 8 days. And from then, the Levites then, the other clans of the Levites, took all of this stuff, and then they, in turn, took it down and threw it into the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley was kind of the city dump, and it remained that way for hundreds of years, actually, Kidron Valley, because it's way down there deep, and the people lived up in the city of David. And so hang on. So that's what they did. They would just throw the stuff in the Kidron Valley, kind of like in the old days when you'd have the old castles and so forth. You had the moat around the castle. Well, the moat was not only to dissuade. I mean, it was very effective in dissuading the anyone who wanted to conquer the place, because guess what? That was where the sewer was also, and anything that anybody didn't want, that got thrown in there. There were probably dead bodies in the moat and so forth, and it was just really, really gross. And so that's what the Kidron Valley was too. And so that's what they did. They just took everything that had defiled the temple and they threw it out into that valley. And so then they also had to go and retrieve or find or fix, or however they did, the things that Ahaz had destroyed. And some of the things, he had cut up into pieces, so that they would have to be melted down, remolded, reshaped, and made into fit vessels that were good for the worship of Adonai. All right. Let me stop and say any comments or questions here so far. Let me get a drink. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read about 16 verses here, and it's going to I'm just going to read through it because I didn't want to kind of stick in here. I'm going to hit the high points, basically, this, because I don't have time for in 1 hour to do all of this. So Hezekiah rose early. This is verse 20. He rose early, gathered the leaders of the city, and went up to the house of Adonai. They brought 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, 7 he-goats as a sin offering for the kingdom, the sanctuary in Judah. And he commanded the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, to offer them on the altar of Adonai. So they slaughtered the bulls, and the Kohanim took the blood and sprinkled it against the altar. Next, they slaughtered the rams and sprinkled the blood against the altar. Then they slaughtered the lambs and sprinkled the blood against the altar. Then the he-goats for the sin offering were brought before the king and the congregation, and they laid their hands on them. The Kohanim then slaughtered them and purified the altar with their blood to make atonement for all Israel. For the king commanded that the burnt offering and the sin offering should be made for all Israel. So he's getting ahead of the game here is what it amounts to. He said, okay, we're going to go ahead and make atonement for all of Israel now, and we're going to start, because we've been in the wrong for so many years. We're going to start doing this right. And so they started slaughtering the animals, and then he said he stationed the Levites in the house of Adonai, and with cymbals and harps and lyres, and according to that, these were instruments. A lot of these instruments were invented by David when he was the king, and then also by God, the king's seer, and and Nathan the prophet. So these guys had a big hand in the musical presentation within the temple. And that was basically, that was 250 years ago that they had developed all this stuff. So the Levites stood with David's instruments, and the Kohanim with the trumpets, and so that's fun. The Levites got to do the regular whatever instruments that they had from David, but the Kohanim, they got to blow the trumpets. And then Hezekiah gave the order to sacrifice the burnt offering on the altar. When the burnt offering began, the Song of Adonai also began with the trumpets, together with the instruments of King David of Israel. The entire congregation prostrated themselves while the singers sang and the trumpeters played. All of this continued until the burnt offering was finished. Now, at the completion of the burnt offering, the king and all who were present with him knelt down and worshiped. All right, now there's some interesting things here. You see all of these lambs. Okay, you didn't need 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, and 7 goats, he goats, for to consecrate all of this stuff. Okay, Hezekiah was going way overboard on all of this stuff because he wanted to make sure that it was big enough, and I hesitate to say showy enough, but he wanted to make sure that the people knew that this was serious business. And I think in a lot of ways he wanted to make sure that God knew his heart, that he was serious about this. So he overdid it. He had more animals than he needed for the consecration, but it was that was what was in his heart, that he wanted to do something big and spectacular for the Lord. And so then they had this big choir of the Kohanim and their trumpets, and the other Levites were other instrumentalists, and so it would have been interesting. I would really have, the musician in me would really like to be able to see or hear what that sounded like. It was, we don't really have an idea today of how that happened, or how that what the sounds were, what the scale that they used back in there. There's some people that have a pretty good idea of what the scale, that the music scale that they use, because in Western music we have one scale, and if you go to say Japan or China, Indonesia, those countries, you might have a different kind of scale. If you watch TV or movies and they're playing their instruments, you can always tell, okay, they're playing this music and this is aha, now we are in China, or ha, now we're in Japan, or whatever, because the music has turned away from John Denver and singing Country Roads to something else where it's a completely different sound, different scale. And so I would just love to be able to listen to that and see what their music sounded like. And with, in all honesty, it might not be all that pleasant to the Western ear, but to those people, it was fabulous. And they said that they sang the Song of Adonai. And let's see, I don't think I've got, yeah, when the burnt offerings began, the Song of Adonai was also begun. Now, that was possibly a specific psalm, or it could have been a song that was written specifically for the worship of Adonai. We don't know what it is, but there's plenty of psalms that would really be in the running for being a song of Adonai. But it was specific. This is the Song of Adonai, not a Song of Adonai. So it was something that was very, very special. And this praise, it lasted for hours and hours. Because why? Because they had the burnt offerings. Now, burnt offerings meant that they had to keep that fire stoked up enough that they could burn the animals that are on the altar down to where there's nothing but ashes left. Now that would take a while. And so the whole time that these animals are burning on the altar for the burnt offering, the singers were singing and the dancers were dancing and the trumpet players were playing their trumpets, and the guitar players were playing their guitars, or their the flutes or the harps and all of that kind of stuff. They kept on singing for hours and hours and hours. So would have been quite a spectacle for sure. And it said that at the completion of all of this, Hezekiah tells them, okay, you've now consecrated yourselves to Adonai. Come near, bring sacrifices and thanks offerings to Adonai. So the congregation brought in sacrifices and thank offerings, and it says, and all those whose hearts were willing brought burnt offerings. So a lot of this was voluntary. They said the number of burnt offerings that the congregation brought was 70 bulls, 100 rams, and 200 lambs. Now, that was just things that people just wanted to give. That was far and above what that was required. Then the animals that were consecrated as sacrifices had 600 bulls, 3,000 sheep. That's a lot of animals too. The Kohanim, there were not enough Kohanim to do all of this stuff. And see, when they were doing the burnt offering, what they had to do is they had to skin the animal. They had to go back in there and flay the animal, meaning that they would have to run a knife along there and peel the hide off of it. Now, if any of you have ever peeled the hide off of a large animal, like a cow or steer, bull, that sort of thing, or deer, it's not that easy to do. It just takes time to do it, even if you're really good at it. And I've seen guys that are really, really good at it, and it still takes them a lot of time to pull that skin off the hide off of the animal. So there weren't enough Kohanim to do all of that. So then they had to go and enlist their cousins, the Levites, and say, hey, come and help us out. And it was interesting that the Bible records that the Levites, who were not the priests, they were more conscientious in consecrating themselves than the Kohanim were. They were taking this stuff much more serious than the Kohanim was. It's a sad commentary that the people who are actually going to be presenting the offerings, and the ones that are front and center before Adonai, they're the ones that got meh. They were not. Just weren't into it as much as the helpers were. And so it's just interesting that the Bible would actually record that. And so says there were also a great many burnt offerings, along with the fat of the peace offering and the drink offering for every burnt offering. So, thus the avodah, the worship of the house of Adonai, was reestablished. Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced because of what God had enabled the people to accomplish, because it happened so suddenly. And basically, in 16 days from start to finish, they had gone in, cleaned out the temple, and just, they had cleaned house, got it all cleaned up, and had animals there, and then they did the sacrifices. So they were back in the sacrificial mode then, after only 16 days, which, it'd been years of neglect that they had to come in there and work on. So, that finishes off chapter 29. Are there any comments or questions so far on this that you might have? Again, if there are any questions, just unmute yourself and jump in. Yeah, Carl.
I'd just like to say that the way I understand it, that you would have had all of the priests and Levites turning up, at least at the beginning, to do this. So there's probably like 25,000 of these people that are around, and they would have to try to coordinate things. Must have been quite an effort.
Yeah, and the numbers, I didn't even attempt to try to come up with numbers on that thing, because we don't know what the whole population was, and then we're only talking about Judah, the area of Judah. There were no priests per se from the northern tribes right at this juncture. Okay, and so, or if there were, the Bible doesn't mention it. So yeah, we don't know, but yeah, it would have certainly been in the hundreds, and possibly, more probably, into the thousands of these guys that were available for service. You're right.
I would think that the vast majority of Levites eventually, since the northern kingdom didn't use Levitical priests or Levites in any way, that I consider, most of them eventually migrated to Judah anyway, I would think.
You would think that there would have been a lot of them. Yeah, we assume that. We don't know for sure, but yeah, I think that's a good assumption, that the Levites would have tried to come on back down. Because we do know that there were people that, of all of the tribes, that at the beginning with Jeroboam, 200 years before that when he started instituting some of his stuff, we know that there were people that said, this is not for me. I'm going to go back down south where they worship the Lord properly. And so, yeah, it would stand to reason that the Levites would have done that too. All right. Any other comments or questions? All right. Then let's go ahead. We'll jump into chapter 30 and verse 1. Hezekiah then sent word to all Israel and Judah, and also wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh to come to the house of Adonai at Jerusalem to keep the Passover for Adonai, the God of Israel. All right. Like I had mentioned before, it had been over 200 years since the northern tribes had worshipped in Jerusalem, because when Rehoboam stayed south, Jeroboam went north, and he established worship centers up in Samaria and also in Dan. He did both of those places so that the people would not go down to Jerusalem, because he was afraid of losing his influence, and that the people would go down to Jerusalem, and then they would be down there, and then maybe conspire against him or whatever. So he set up worship centers up there in Samaria and in Dan. So it had been a couple of hundred years since people then were allowed to, or asked to, or invited to come down to Jerusalem, or go up to Jerusalem, actually, to worship God at the temple. So this was a big deal. This was really a big deal. Now, one of the things that I wanted to point out to you is that they sent word to all Israel and Judah, letters to Ephraim and Manasseh. Those are the two biggies. Those are the biggest tribes that were up there, and asking all of them, because they would have been the ones that would have had to basically grant the permission to have Passover down in Jerusalem, where they where God had said, this is where I want you to sacrifice. So here they're sending it off to Ephraim and Manasseh to say, okay, this is what we would like you to do. And so, okay, the question was, why did the Levites leave the temple? Well, the Levites, at one point, in one part of the history, when the kingdom split at, right after Solomon, well, then Levites lived all over Israel. There were the Levitical towns, but then the Levites spread out, and they lived in all the villages and so forth too. And so when the kingdom split, some of them couldn't get back to Jerusalem, or perhaps Jeroboam would not allow them to go back. And then that's one time when the Levites would not have been at the temple. Then the most recent, what we're talking about here, was that in the time of Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah, he had closed the temple worship down. He had just shut down the complex, period. And so there was no place for the priests and the Levites. And so they basically, with no support, no tithe money coming in there for their support, then they had to go back home and farm what little plots they had. Each town where the Levitical town where the Levites lived, they had 1,500 feet from the wall of the city around the whole city. So they just go out 1,500 feet, and that area, that buffer around the city, was the Levites' property. And so they could raise crops. They could they would have animals there, but. And Pat asked, well, how many Levites? Well, there were thousands of them, but there were also hundreds of towns, and the Levites certainly concentrated in certain towns, but okay, let's just say it this way. The Levites did not get wealthy on this system, okay? And so they were basically the poor relatives. And that's one reason that God said, okay, if you can't go to the temple for the feast for the regalim, then you convert the fruit of your labor, your tithe and so forth, into money, and then you buy your wine, your strong drink, or whatever it is that you want to drink, plus food and all of the good stuff, and you celebrate as unto the Lord in your own city. And he says, and don't forget to invite the Levites. And so that was a throw then to the Levites, that the people of Israel were to keep supporting them. So when the temple shut down and they had no mechanism then for supporting the Levites, or as an excuse that they didn't have to support the Levites, then the Levites by necessity would have had to go back home and work their fields, their orchards, their vineyards that they had, just to support themselves. Because remember, the synagogue system had not yet been invented yet. There was only one place to worship, and that was Jerusalem. There were no synagogues and places of worship or study in the villages of Israel. That is a feature that came about as a result of the Babylonian captivity. We'll talk about that in the course of this this class at the end, basically toward the end. All right. Good question, Jonathan. That was good. All right. So then, in verse 2, the king and his officials and the entire congregation in Jerusalem had decided to celebrate Passover in the second month, for they were not able to celebrate at the regular time, since not enough Kohanim had consecrated themselves, nor had the people assembled in Jerusalem. The matter seemed right in the eyes of the king and of the entire community, so they decided to issue a decree and to proclaim it throughout all Israel, from Beersheba to Dan, calling the people to come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover of Adonai, the God of Israel, for it had not been celebrated as prescribed for a long time. Yeah, a long time, over 200 years, it hadn't been celebrated like that, where everyone from Dan to Beersheba were invited and expected to come. So, the reason that they couldn't celebrate Passover when it was supposed to be, remember they started on the 1st of Nisan, cleaning up the temple. It took them 16 days. Well, Passover starts on the 14th day, where you slaughter the lambs. They weren't ready. They just couldn't get it all together in that length of time. So they said, well, if we can't do it, then there is a provision in the Bible that says that you can do it a month later. If you were, say, you were defiled because you had a death in the family and you had to take care of your loved ones, or if you were traveling and couldn't make it back, then you could do the Passover a month later. And so we even invoked that in 2020, or tried to, with the idea that, okay, we can't do Passover when it's supposed to do, so we'll do it a month later. Well, a month later, the COVID craziness was still going on, and everything was all shut down, so there was still no way. So we didn't do Passover last year, and now this year we did it in our homes. We trained everyone at Tree of Life to do it in your home, and people said they really enjoyed being able to do that. So. Anyway, the problem with it was that the circumstances to do it a month later didn't quite really fit what they were doing. It was just that, hey, we're not ready yet. They weren't traveling. They weren't. The temple was not yet cleaned up, consecrated. So I guess you could say it was still in a little bit of defilement, but that was a little bit outside the box. But anyway, the people said, well, let's do this anyway. We'll do it a month later. And everybody got together and says, you know what? That sounds like a great idea. Let's do it that way. And because we don't want to wait a whole year and do it next year. We want to kick off this worship of God properly and quickly. The king thought it was very, very important to do that. And at his command, the couriers went throughout all Israel and Judah with letters from the king and his officials saying, you men of Israel, turn back to Adonai, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, and he will return to the remnant of you who escaped from the hand of the kings of Assyria. Do not be like your fathers and brothers who acted unfaithfully against Adonai, the God of their fathers, so that he made them a horror, as you see. Do not stiffen your neck as your fathers did, but reconcile to Adonai and come to his temple, which he has consecrated forever, and worship Adonai, your God, that his burning anger may turn away from you. For if you return to Adonai, your brothers and children will receive compassion before their captors, and he will return to this land. For Adonai, your God, is compassionate and merciful. He will not turn his face away from you if you return to him. So here, Hezekiah is preaching to these guys. He says, you need to repent. You need to come back. Let's start this worship service over again after a couple of 100 years. Let's do this and do it right. And when we do, with a clean and a pure heart, God is going to answer our prayers. He will bring the captives home. And there's some things here I wanted to point out again. The 10 tribes were still, there were still the tribes up there in that land. All right. Because there was a remnant. They talked about the remnant. He sent letters and couriers out there. And then people from those tribes actually responded and came back. Other people from different tribes responded to the negative, but they were still identified as those tribal persons, from the tribe of Zebulun and Asher and Dan and Ephraim and so on and so forth that were mentioned by name. So he tied this temple-based worship to the return of the captives. He says, if you do this, you draw near to God, he's going to draw near to you, and he's going to bring your relatives back with him. So he is convinced that God will show them favor. And so as the couriers traveled from town to town through the country of Ephraim and Manasseh as far as Zebulun, they were scorned and mocked. Nevertheless, some men from Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. So as here's a map again that we've seen many times before of the tribal layouts where they would have been. And you'll note that, this is when they first started out. Dan was down here. They never could get their act together. So they ended up, Dan actually having a little, their land was up here in this area where it says Dan. All right. And, but this is where Manasseh, of course, had the lion's share of it all. Ephraim was also pretty large. And, these other tribes, Gad and Reuben, they had unfortunately kind of been swallowed up by this time, and swallowed up by the Ammonites, and so they weren't really anybody to reckon with at that point.
I just wanted to. The question I had is, Hoshea or whatever is still the king in Israel at this time, right? This is the beginning of Hezekiah's rule, was still before the fall of the northern kingdom. And so the king of Israel must have been open to allowing them to come and bring these people in for the Feast of the Passover, where at the time of Jeroboam they would not have been.
Yeah, that either that or he was either open to it or he was so weak at this point that Hezekiah just went ahead and said, "Hey, come on down. The invitation is open." There's nothing in the Bible though that talks about the any kind of resistance from Samaria, but these guys had already been under attack by the Assyrians. There was a major incursion by Assyria before the 722 fall, in the seventh year of Hezekiah's reign. So the Assyrians had already come in there and that beat the stuffing out of Israel and was taking tribute from them. Yeah. Even at that time, and so and had carried off some people. So the tribes were still intact there, and at that point, yeah. And so, but very shortly thereafter, then Israel falls, and that's where people say, "Yeah, well, then all of Israel, all the tribes were lost." Well, no, they never really were, because when we're coming back from Babylon after the fall of Judah, they did talk about the ones from this tribe, that tribe, and the other tribe coming back from Babylon too. So the idea that they were all gone and lost. They dispersed. They actually dispersed, and some of them, they stayed away, and even to this day, down in Ethiopia, there are those. Got in Nigeria, you got the Igbo tribe. You got other ones down in other parts of Africa where some of these Levites had gone, or Levites and others had gone, and basically spread Judaism down there too. So. Does that make them a lost tribe? I don't know, but the idea that Israel, the tribal people left and they went up to Great Britain and Denmark and all of those kind of things. I'm not convinced on that. So I'm going to have to really hurry on to this stuff to get through the rest of this. So they sent these couriers all through Israel. Some of them scorned them, but they were accepted by a good bit. Ephraim and Dan had been the centers. I talked about that, where those were the two centers of worship. And then the hand of God was also on Judah to give them one heart to do what the king and the officials commanded by the word of Adonai. Now, a very large assembly gathered in Jerusalem to celebrate the feast of Matzot, the feast of unleavened bread, in the second month. So they got it together and were able to do it in the second month. They arose, they removed the altars from the incense altars and all the incense altars that were in Jerusalem, and threw them down in the city dump in the Kidron Valley. So these people that came from all over Israel and Judah, they were not idle. They got down there and they picked up all of these places where people were offering incense and so forth, and they destroyed them, and then they took them out and dumped them in the valley down there. And so then they cleaned up they assisted in cleaning up all of these pagan sites throughout all of Jerusalem, is said. And so another thing that I wanted to point out, then they slaughtered the Passover lamb on the 14th day of the second month. The Kohanim and the Levites were ashamed and consecrated themselves and brought burnt offerings into the house of Adonai. They stood at their posts as prescribed in the Torah of Moses, the man of God. The Kohanim sprinkled the blood that they received from the hand of the Levites. For there were many in the congregation that had not consecrated themselves. Therefore, the Levites were in charge of slaughtering the Passover lambs for everyone that was not ceremonially clean, in order to consecrate them to Adonai. Okay, so what are we missing here if you're not really careful about watching it? Well, it says that the Levites, the Kohanim, took the blood from the Levites, and because the people, normally the people would consecrate themselves. They would come in, they would bring their animal. The Levites, the Kohanim, would slaughter the animal, and the lay person was able to put his hands on the animal and transfer the sins and so forth. But these people were not clean, ceremonially clean. So the Levites had to stand in their stead and do it for them, is what that means. So there was kind of a make do. They were just doing the best they could with what they had at that point. And so then going ahead with the Passover, they had a great multitude of people, many from Ephraim, and here these other tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, Issachar and Zebulun. And we had already heard that there were some from some of the other tribes too. But they were there; they were ready to go, but they weren't cleansed. But they wanted to do Passover anyway, so they did. Hezekiah knew this, and so what he said was, "Look, I'll pray to God that, okay, in this instance, we know it's not right. We know it's not what you said to be done, but we just couldn't get it together that quickly. Would you forgive these people and forgive it says, and Adonai heard Hezekiah and healed the people." Well, should we assume then that these people were getting sick and dying because they did Passover incorrectly? No, I think what we're talking about here is that Adonai heard Hezekiah, and he says he healed the people of their uncleanness, their ceremonial uncleanness, and therefore they were then able to stand before God in righteousness. So that it was that the healing of God here is the refuah, which is the same word as for healing a body. But here they were talking about being unclean, and that's where the healing, and I think that's where that comes into play there. And so they went ahead and they celebrated with all of the instruments and all of that for a whole week, and did the matzah thing for a week. And it was so good. They felt so great about it. They went ahead and they went ahead and then said, well, let's do it another week. Now, have you ever been someplace where, you know, it was just so good? We one year we were at a conference, and it was the National Jewish Fellowship that we were in, and it was so nice, and we had such a wonderful time, and it only lasted like 3 days, and at the end of that 3 days, we just go, wow, I just wish this could go on a little bit longer. Couldn't we just do this longer? Good. Everybody had to go back home to their own responsibilities and so forth. But and I've been that way at Messiah Conference before too, up in Pennsylvania. You go for a week and you say, "Oh wow, wasn't this great? Couldn't we stay just another few days and keep on going?" Well, no, they're only good for a week, and so that's but that's what the people here were. They had a week of it, and they said that's just not enough. After 200 years, we need to do this some more. So they did it another week of celebrating, worshiping God, and offering animals. And it said the king offered up 1,000 bulls, 700 sheep, and then the officials in the government offered up another 1,000 bulls and 10,000 sheep, and so that everyone would have of these animals to they would have the burnt offerings, the atonement for them, and basically more like fellowship. They were eating. These people were able to eat these things because that's what a fellowship offering is. And so it was a great time. They said there was great joy in Jerusalem, for nothing like this had happened in Jerusalem since the time of Solomon, 200 years before. And that they said the Kohanim, the Levitical Kohanim, arose and blessed the people, and Adonai heard their voice, for their prayer reached heaven, his holy dwelling place. So there, the priest then would get up there at the end of all of this, and they would do the Aaronic benediction, and may the Lord bless and keep you, light of his face shine on you and be gracious to you, the light of his countenance be lifted up to you, and give you peace. That's what they would have recited to them, and God heard them, and he blessed the people. And so it was a great time of revival, and that pretty well closes us down. I've gone a little bit over the hour, but I needed to